I'm not really a fan of Pink Floyd, and I've been a critic of people who've hailed David Gilmour as one of the greatest guitar players of all time. A lot of my audience likes it when I do these full band overviews and explain my perspective on it, so I recently chose to do Pink Floyd. I did multiple listens of their studio discography multiple times in a row, and did some research. While I still don't love them, I think they are extremely worthy of praise and respect. Still, I just never find myself saying, you know what I need to listen to right now? Slow, psychedelic wallowing in misery. I have so many thoughts about this band, and it's not simple for me to explain why I'm not fully bought into it, but I'm hoping with this video you'll better understand my perspective. Here's why I am not a fan of Pink Floyd. Let's take it from the beginning. Pink Floyd started as a blues jam band, and their namesake was actually two prominent blues guitarists from California. Syd Barrett was the personality who propelled them into the spotlight, helped ingratiate them into the London underground music scene, and really prodded the band to try and make music that hadn't been heard before. Through hard work, consistently playing shows, and building their network, they were eventually signed to a label and began recording at Abbey Road Studios. This started their trajectory towards being one of the greatest rock bands of all time, and one of the first bands to elevate rock and roll above the relatively droll, sex-focused music. Though Syd Barrett was only on 2 albums, his influence and vision is what would define Pink Floyd. He would continue to be their guiding star and their well of inspiration. How could a man who was only involved with 2 of the very many Pink Floyd albums be so consequential to the band? Well, I think it's a good time to start diving into those albums and explain. We're gonna tackle these chronologically, but I grouped these albums by the eras that I perceived. If you think I missed something, or if how I grouped them wasn't quite right, let me know in the comments down below. I am not an authority on this band, and I would love to get your guys' input and feedback. This is how I perceive Pink Floyd, and I would love to know how you perceive them too. Let's learn from each other. First era, the Syd Barrett era. I grouped 4 albums into this era, and Syd is only on 2 of them, so why would I put 2 albums in this era that he didn't belong to? I believe the latter 2 albums are so profoundly impacted by his absence and really shows a young band still trying to discover their sound. I recall an interview with Roger Waters where he said something to the degree that when Pink Floyd started, they avoided learning other people's material because they were afraid that it was going to color their writing too much. Seems crazy, right? Especially considering they started out as a blues cover band. I guess to paint this picture further, one of the early gigs they had was a 90-minute set in this crazy club, and they didn't have enough material for 90 minutes, so the end of their songs would just be these ad-lib, improv, psychedelic jams. I mean, yeah, it's more original than learning more songs, I guess. On one hand, they didn't really have a great grasp of what they were doing with their instruments or a great music vocabulary, except for maybe Rick Wright and David Gilmour a little more so. Gilmour wouldn't join till later. On the other hand, this would prompt them to write from the head and the heart, which I think could make it more likely that they would make something people hadn't heard before. I have no doubt that Syd Barrett was pushing them to do these wild and crazy things with sound, especially a lot of the non-tonal noise and massive spatial effects that you'll find on the first 2 albums. But it's my belief that the team at Abbey Road, specifically Norman Smith and Pete Bowen, would make an indelible mark on this band. Pete Bowen and Norman Smith were engineers on Beatles records before. Pete Bowen was actually Norman Smith's mentor, and Norman Smith would wind up being the producer for 4 of Pink Floyd's albums. They learned a lot experimenting with George Martin and the Beatles that they were able to bring to the arsenal of Pink Floyd. Without Pink Floyd's experience working with engineers on the forefront of sound recording and sound design at the time, I don't think they would have had their top-tier psychedelic rock sound that they are known for. In my opinion, we should credit the Abbey Road team for the Pink Floyd sound as much as Pink Floyd, but hot take, I guess. The dissonance between crazy, psychotropic-inspired painter Syd Barrett and the more orthodox leanings of the Abbey Road team, I think is what made these first 2 records. The first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, was bizarre. plain and simple, whether or not you like that flavor of bizarre. Piper was raw, whimsical, and experimental. Even the more normal songs on there really didn't obey conventions for the time. It's marked by saturated timbres, driving rhythms, and abrasive atmospheric sounds. For the time, I would consider it groundbreaking, but not really accessible. You could tell they were still experimenting and fiddling around. This seemed like a band that was showing you their search as opposed to confidently presenting you their discoveries. There's something very admirable about the effort and results of Piper, but I myself don't really enjoy listening to it. The album relies too much on whimsy for my tastes, both musically and lyrically, and I'm just really not a fan of Barrett's vocals. Outside of the experimentation, it all felt a bit aimless and a tad pointless. Norman Smith tried very hard to rein in Syd Barrett's creative energies and his want to be so different from the norm. And it seemed like Syd Barrett wanted to separate himself from the norm in more ways than just his music expression. Syd started to develop schizophrenia. People suspect it was triggered when he overdid it on LSD, whether it was too much all at once or just way too much over a short period of time. It took a toll on him, as well as the pressures of his career. While Syd Barrett was the driving force of this band, he really didn't want to be a star in that way and have that type of public pressure. Similarly to Kurt Cobain, I just don't think he was mentally equipped to handle it at that time. That kind of pressure, paired with the proclivity to escape through drug use, can really ruin people, and I feel like it definitely ruined Syd Barrett. It's really sad. He was becoming increasingly difficult to talk to and to work with, to the point where Pink Floyd were just like, we don't know that we can rely on him to perform shows. So they had to call in a friend. Drummer Nick Mason called in guitarist David Gilmour to fill in live show duties, and they wanted to keep on Syd Barrett as a non-performing writer, but it just didn't work out. Syd and David would both contribute on the next record, A Saucer Full of Secrets. In my opinion, this record feels substantially more focused than the first record. They still experimented a lot with weird sounds and pushed a hard psychedelic vibe, but this entire structure and process felt more reined in. I feel like keyboardist Rick Wright played a more substantial part on this record, and count off in the comments the number of times I say the word substantial in this video. All around, it actually felt like every instrument just had a more deliberate reason to be playing what they played on that record. While the overall vibe of this album still feels a little flower power meets 60s Brit rock for my personal tastes, all in all, I would say it is themed and developed substantially better. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a combination of David Gilmour's flowery writing style and Norman Smith's more orthodox approach to producing records that was winning over a faltering Syd Barrett. They still lean on whimsy more than I would prefer, and the title track is emblematic of what I don't like about this early era. It's a 12-minute fusion between a dissonant jam and a sound collage. Like, that's neat enough, but it comes across as overbearing, self-indulgent, and kind of pretentious.
Somebody once told me the world's gonna roll me.
Like, annoyingly pretentious. Again, I can appreciate experimentation, especially the types of sounds that they were able to create at that technological level in that time, but it's just seemingly random ventures, and I just feel like those don't age very well. Outside of appreciating them like a cultural time capsule, I don't enjoy listening to these tracks at all. On the flip side, a song like Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun is far ahead of its time, in my opinion. It's almost like a proto-Tool song. It's something you weren't getting from any other bands in that era. I wouldn't say I love the track per se, but I'm extremely impressed with the vision and foresight. Something remarkable about these first two albums, especially considering that Pink Floyd avoided learning their instruments traditionally, they were remarkably tight. Bands with similar histories like The Doors started out hilariously, laughably, embarrassingly loose, whereas Pink Floyd seemed to take themselves more seriously with making their music, even when fully engrossed in whimsy. The writing on this record has some more quirky melodic ideas that I think were reined in by the proclivities of Rick Wright and Norman Smith. As a musician and writer, you can hear where some of these ideas just originated from noodling or jamming, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you can hear it. But I can also hear where these noodling ideas were structured purposefully for effect. That's cool. These inclinations continue to exist and evolve as you get further into the discography, I think culminating with The Wall, but we'll get to that later. Put simply, the writing is usually unorthodox, but relatively simple and digestible. I'd say the least digestible part about it is the structure, and maybe some of the crazy sounds that they just happen to throw in random places. After Saucerful of Secrets, Syd Barrett left the band and left his music career behind. Since Syd Barrett was the driving force behind this band and had actually written a lot of their songs, this left them feeling directionless, and I think you can really hear this on their next album, More. To me, More felt uninspired and was really just a long slog to try and get through. It wasn't terrible, but it really only felt a hair above average. I literally just learned a few hours before recording that this was actually an album that was a movie score for a film called More, so that could also explain some of their decisions. I mean, heck, a big part of it falling flat for me could be that Pink Floyd didn't have control over their production schedule. It wouldn't surprise me if they felt rushed just to get it done. I would prefer to listen to most Pink Floyd albums before this one. Well, except before Roger Waters left, but we will get to that. I think even Pink Floyd agrees that this is the weakest album before Roger Waters left. Even the following album, Ummagumma, feels extremely disjointed. The first disc is a bunch of live performances, and the second disc is a compilation of solo tracks. They each individually wrote a handful of songs by themselves and then released it. If you needed more evidence that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that album's it. That whole side came across as aimless, pretentious, and bloated to me. Even David Gilmour would later admit he basically had no clue what he was doing when he got to the studio. He basically wrote those songs while recording. This album marks for me the pinnacle of Pink Floyd searching for, but not finding their identity, but also signals the end of the Syd Barrett era. Syd Barrett would continue to be an important figure and point of inspiration for the band, but this to me marks the end of the band trying to define themselves by him. The second era, self-discovery. Pink Floyd's fifth album, Atom Heart Mother, feels like landing on their feet after being tossed into the air by Syd Barrett leaving. The title track, like a lot of longer Pink Floyd songs, feels to me like it's bloated and needlessly noisy, but there's an excellent use of orchestral instruments with great themes and dynamics. I was vibing to the continuous drive, and there are moments where I actually felt inspired. All in all, I like this track. The rest of the album is kinda meh for me, to be honest, but it's not bad. With the exception of the last track, Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast. I don't need 5 minutes of someone chewing loudly with their mouth open directly into my ear.
Thanks, I hate it.
I hear a lot more confidence on this album than I did on any other album before it. The next album is Metal, and correct me if I am wrong, this is where Roger Waters started to take more of a leadership role in the band. The intro track, One of These Days, is a psychedelic blues jam that emphasizes tone and production. In my opinion, it was their first time touching the brilliance that would become the vibe for Dark Side of the Moon. And this is Pink Floyd announcing to the world that they had officially entered the 70s. The 60s sound was gone. While the rest of the album is a little too relaxed and southern fried for my particular tastes, it's a good album with solid hooks and good production. All in all, well constructed. With the exception of, and this is where the dislike ratio goes into the toilet, Echoes. I reviewed this once before on my show Song Suggestion Friday years ago. I just really can't with this song. I don't hate it as much as I used to. I listened to it twice for this video, but there's a reason why I don't hate it as much as I used to. Because I'm not forced to have to elaborate upon it with specific words. For a song that's 24 minutes long, I don't feel like it has that much to say. You could accomplish that entire song in half the time. Easy. No doubt in my mind. It feels needlessly long and amorphous. There's parts of the sound design I really don't like. Some moments feel really cool, but it's also like, why did you have to make it that long just to prove a point? It's totally cool if you enjoy this track. I acknowledge most people consider it to be their masterpiece, their first masterpiece. But I don't get it. It's not for me. It's just not my thing, man. Anyway, let's move on to their 7th album, Obscured by Clouds, which again, I recently learned was also made for a film. Much of this album moves back into what I don't care for about Pink Floyd, and I think is probably the primary reason why I don't call myself a fan. I'm not gonna dive into detail about that right now because I feel like there's a more impactful example later in their albums. To boil it down enough right now, after listening to this album 3 times, I still forget what it sounds like. There are definable themes on each track, but the consistently middling tempo with no payoff from the dynamics or from the voice leading really just leaves me wanting. There are some cool ideas here that I just don't think were developed as effectively as they could have been. The one exception I would say is the song Childhood's End, which features a great infectious chill groove and a cool vocal performance and vocal melody by David Gilmour. Though even on this track, those emphatic chord hits that come as kind of the response to the verse you just listened to really just don't feel like they fully pay off to me. I even like this song, and there's just something not quite satisfying about it. And this song is very reminiscent to me of Do It Again by Steely Dan. It came out the same year. It just all around feels peculiar, and I don't think anyone stole anything from anyone else. It's just odd. I do want to highlight though, the outro on Absolutely Curtains is actually pretty cool. I found it interesting. After going through that whole album and then crossfading to this soothing, relaxing, very innocent chant, it was really nice. It actually made you think, you know, what is this? What's the answer beyond the face value of this music and these words? As someone unfamiliar with whatever culture that comes from, it was oddly satisfying. The 3rd era, the Roger Waters era. Finally, we arrive at Pink Floyd's 8th studio album and widely acclaimed masterpiece, Dark Side of the Moon. This is the album that shot them into superstardom. This is the culmination of 7 albums worth of discovery. The album was written mostly from jam sessions in a shed and experimentation in the studio. And you can hear the jam sessions because one of the main themes that recurs several times on the album is just a bounce between 1 and 4. Basic blues shit. It's easily the best sound design they've ever done, with fantastic sound portraits and incredible tone. It's a very satisfying, enjoyable, and engaging listen from back to front. It is a fantastic album to listen to in its entirety. But I never find myself saying, you know what I need to listen to right now? Dark Side of the Moon. Even though I enjoy it. It is a consistent journey that is so coherently assembled, and that's borne out by this being the most collaborative record Pink Floyd would ever do. This is Pink Floyd at their greatest point as a group. But even acknowledging all of that, I still don't know that I feel inspired by it. I mean, it moves me. I feel an emotional impact from it. But I think it encourages me to stay still as opposed to inspires me to move forward. And I think that really speaks to Pink Floyd's music in general. It's extremely reflective music that people describe as spacey, but that space or outer space element that people hear and feel, I think is actually a reflection of that infinite universe that is the human mind and the imagination. And while I fully appreciate it and sometimes like it, sometimes it's just a little much for me. I think I prefer something even a little more poignant and actually explosive. I would describe Dark Side of the Moon and Pink Floyd's sound in general as softened. Even with these critiques, which are really just observations from the lens of my own personal taste, this album is exceptional and incredible. I highly recommend that everyone, at least once in their life, listen to this album back to front. It is worth it. Next is Wish You Were Here, another excellent album. Some think it's their best. In my opinion, this is Pink Floyd's most consistent hit song album. This one really has great themes and great hooks throughout. This album drew inspiration from Syd Barrett losing his mind and leaving the band, and from other experiences they had in the music industry. The chord progression on most of these tracks are pretty boiled down, but the production and tone more than make up for it. Shine On You Crazy Diamond is a fan favorite that people lose their marbles over when they play it live. To me, feels a little bloated. I know, shocker that I would say that. I love the main chord progressions and the melodies. The da 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 da, the da 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 da. Shine on you crazy diamond. That whole chord progression and voice leading are fantastic. But then the needlessly bloated, aimless jammy bits that say next to nothing for far too long are just like, get to the point, please. It is not carrying me along with you to wherever you think you're going with this song. This is my primary issue, I think, with enjoying Pink Floyd. They have these bite-sized melodic ideas that are really nice that never explore further than just repeating them a shitload and hitting very long notes at a middling tempo. It doesn't really explore that much, in my opinion. They lean mostly into timbre. These critiques lend themselves towards labels that they sometimes get, like pretentious or self-indulgent. I would say, for the most part, much less pretentious, much more self-indulgent. Here's why. The entire identity of this band is built upon the foundation of drug inspiration. Their earliest fans were whacked out on drugs and loved being taken on a journey, musically speaking and drug speaking. Their music has never been about sophistication or being present. It is intended to take you somewhere else from the present, which is why I think it irritates me so much when I'm asked to focus on it. I don't think you are supposed to focus on it. Having it softly travel along with me can be enjoyable sometimes. Sometimes it can be a little boring. But trying to dissect it with an analytical eye will exhaust itself extremely quickly. This is not to say that it's bad. It's just not very interesting for me to talk about at length in a video. Also, most bands who attempt this softened, washed out jam vibe are usually very boring. And I would say Pink Floyd is at least one of the best to have ever done this. But I just don't consider most of their jams to be that magical to me, especially in an isolated studio format. And yes, this band is supposed to be experienced live. That's how they started, that's how they wrote, and they put a lot of emphasis on that. I am well aware of that. Not to mention how much they pioneered the live experience, which is insane. But I don't usually place a lot of personal value on music that requires multimedia to be fully appreciated. Again, not that that makes that inherently a bad thing. It's just how I like to consume music. Shine On You Crazy Diamond is a microcosm of my feelings on Pink Floyd as a whole. Moments of real genius surrounded by overbloated music that as a prog musician, I find to be mostly mundane. This music was strongly inspired while under the influence, and unintentionally, I think, is best enjoyed while you are listening to it under the influence. I don't think I should have to be under the influence to fully appreciate a piece of music. And if it's actually necessary, that devalues the art to me. This is not to take anything away from Pink Floyd or their accomplishments or their work. It's just my perspective.
You're saying that trans activists could lead to the deaths of millions of people?
You have a mechanism in your brain that's seriously wrong. The data on that's pretty clear.
Anyway, let's get back to the album Wish You Were Here. Besides both halves of the Shine On You Crazy Diamond movements, the rest of these songs are excellent. Have a Cigar, which I gave an equal sign on Song Suggestion Friday, is still an excellent song. I could hear that song and especially Welcome to the Machine on the wall. And I think really Wish You Were Here feels to me like Junior The Wall. Both albums touch on similar themes, and they both draw inspiration from Syd Barrett. Even the literary themes are parallel. Wish You Were Here focused on absence, and The Wall focused on isolation. Both involve feeling or wanting to be alone. Roger Waters had taken full creative control over the lyrics by Dark Side of the Moon and did so again on this album. Both have very good lyrics. But this album is where Pink Floyd started to splinter. Roger Waters is actually known for saying Dark Side of the Moon was really where he felt Pink Floyd could have ended and kind of did in its own way. The band didn't know how to follow up Dark Side of the Moon. Hell, if I made Dark Side of the Moon, I wouldn't know how to follow that up. And it wasn't just trying to make another creative and inventive album, it was trying to live up to the commercial success of that album, which can be even more toxic to a person. They had finally made it when they released Dark Side of the Moon, and they felt empty inside after they had achieved their goals and their dreams. You can hear the emptiness on Wish You Were Here, and it makes sense why they would lean into absence as the primary driver for this album. Between the band and really everyone involved with the production not being fully focused on the outset of recording, and a disagreement between David Gilmour and Roger Waters as to how to put Shine On You Crazy Diamond on this record, you really noticed Roger Waters starting to make his presence known in a more unpleasant way. In my opinion, there were a lot of creative decisions that Roger Waters fought for that I think were good choices and good vision, but he was also known for being a bit of a jerk sometimes. That's putting it very mildly. Pink Floyd's next album was Animals. I still don't know that I understand fully the animal metaphors that Roger Waters was trying to get at in this album, and I think some of the lyrics come across a little over cynical at times. The Pigs on the Wing theme is actually quite pleasant and memorable. The rest of this album I can forget about musically, to be honest. David Gilmour said that Roger Waters could be so focused on the lyrics that sometimes he would forget about like the song and the music. I feel that statement on this album. These songs are not bad by any means, I just don't find them particularly memorable. It actually feels a little exhausting trying to make it the whole way through this album. The band continued to fracture further, and their shows were getting bigger and more elaborate. As the shows grew, so did the band's disconnect from their audience. They began in the underground with very small venues and having a very real connection with their fans, and now they were superstars and had security. The band loved that connection with fans and really wanted to give them a full experience to be paid attention to, not just another reason to get sauced and party. Waters was growing increasingly agitated with fans who were making a ruckus instead of paying attention, compounding with band issues and band conflicts, as well as a divorce that happened not too long ago. It culminated for Waters when he saw a fan who was making a ruckus and acting pretty terrible, actually, and he wound up spitting in the fan's face. This event was the catalyst for Roger Waters writing the rock opera that would be known as The Wall. The Wall, in my opinion, is the greatest Pink Floyd album ever, and one of the greatest albums of all time. I did not think that before embarking on this journey listening through this whole discography. At this point, I'm willing to say I love this album. How incredible, vulnerable, and honest. It's a look at how emotional damage makes music stars become more and more disconnected from fans, their friends and family, and eventually even themselves. I do not have enough time to dive into all of the detail of this album, the richness, and how I think it's even more autobiographical than Roger Waters wants to admit. It's the story of our main character, Pink, who builds his metaphorical wall to protect himself and keep people out, to the point where he even begins to lose himself. There are so many themes in this album, both musically and literally, that connect and evolve so well. And even though it's a descent into madness and resentment, it actually does have a happy ending. The most compelling part about this to me was going into this album blind, not fully understanding what was happening, but glomming enough of a story from contextual clues. This is by no means a perfect album. Disc 2 definitely drags in some places and gets really confusing if you don't have outside context. This was really Roger Waters' baby. He had most of the pre-production done by the time he arrived at the studio, almost all of the writing done, and he was really the one who contributed most, if not only, conceptually. This is also the most contentious album this original foursome would work on together. Keyboardist Rick Wright wound up being fired before the album was done. Gilmour and Mason were basically pushed to the side while Bob Ezrin and Roger Waters were very contentious about the direction and vision for these songs and the album as a whole. There is a lot more to it than this, but needless to say, there was a lot of tension during the making of The Wall, and it did not resolve itself very well. Pink Floyd's 12th studio album, The Final Cut, has been sarcastically called the first Roger Waters solo album. He basically called all the shots, wrote all the songs, and pissed everyone off. On its own, the album was okay, but not great. Knowing that it's the follow-up to The Wall, this album is actually pretty sad. My first thought listening through this album was that it was trying way too hard to recapture the magic of The Wall in the worst ways. I actually learned later that there were songs that were written for The Wall that didn't make it, that found their way onto this album. To quote David Gilmour, if it wasn't good enough for The Wall, why is it good enough for this album? Where The Wall was vulnerable and relatable and actually very humble, this album came across as preachy and kinda narrow-minded a bit. I will say this is easily the least psychedelic Pink Floyd album that I remember listening to, but it is still such a drag to get through this. I sympathize with Roger Waters' feelings on war, but this album did not connect with me in any meaningful way, and I think a lot of times that bears itself out with a lot of fans too. David Gilmour finally had enough of Roger Waters' crap and kicked him out of the band. The fallout was ugly. So ugly, they are still not on good terms today. I feel like I could do an entire video essay on the character Pink from The Wall succumbing to the worms and a lot of Roger Waters' decisions and somewhat erratic asshole-ish behavior, but for another time. The final era, the Gilmour era. This is where Gilmour took over the band, and frankly, this is where I stopped reviewing these albums individually. The edge and the witty lyrics left when Roger Waters left. Even with Rick Wright returning to the band, you can hear an important part of the band musically absent on the following releases. It's then you realize just how important Roger Waters was to the sound of that band for decades. Their next two records, A Momentary Lapse of Reason and Division Bell, which are also like 7 years apart, are only slightly different from one another. At least to my ears, they're only slightly different from one another. Everything just got really 80s up, and I lost interest. The Endless River, I couldn't make it through this album. I just didn't care. I so didn't care. All right, so now what? Having touched on all of the albums now, what is it that really makes Pink Floyd great that isn't just Rick Beato going through one song? What's their secret sauce? I've identified 6 factors. 1, they worked really hard and maintained focus. Even at their lowest points, they still managed to find inspiration and derive from it. 2, they pushed their creativity to the point of innovation, and they still maintained being very honest and very relatable. 3, part of keeping it relatable was the simplicity of the composition. Even with some heady concepts and unorthodox structure, they still managed to keep it easy to comprehend. It was still speaking to the common man. 4, part of speaking to the common man was the lyrics. Smartly written, equally poetic and ordinary, they hit this really interesting intersection that just worked so well. While some of these lyrics can be hit or miss for me, it's undeniably a factor of their greatness. 5, their live shows were incredible presentations and changed how musicians would do live shows from then on. I cannot overstate how much Pink Floyd did to redefine music concerts as we know them. 6, most people would say that Pink Floyd's mood that they create is the most important aspect of their greatness. In my opinion, it is second in importance. Let me explain. Pink Floyd does have a way of allowing you to sink in and alter your state of mind with their music. It's quite inviting, it's quite remarkable. But how are they able to accomplish this? Part of it is the tempo, for sure. Part of it is the composition. But frankly, without the most important factor, even those two combined would still result in boring songs. 7, timbre. The key to Pink Floyd, without a doubt in my mind, is timbre. The soundscapes that they set up have particular tone dialings with weird effects and recording techniques that were beyond what other people were doing. All the groundbreaking sound design and sound collages. Yes, the compositions are crucial, but without the timbre design, without the production, I think they would come across as quite ordinary. David Gilmour's feel that everyone seems to reference and ziz over all the time are a huge part of factoring into that timbre. People allow themselves to be carried away into these different states of mind because the timbre allows them to put down their defenses. It invites them to come along on the journey. The composition takes you along on that journey, and then different elements of the composition and timbre together hit those satisfying moments that confirm to you it was worth the journey. Pink Floyd's innovation leans mostly on timbre and how they made people rethink and recontextualize timbre in music and what it means to them. So those are the reasons why I think Pink Floyd are great. So what complaints could I possibly have? Why I'm not a fan. Here's my complaints about one of the most deeply loved bands in the world. 1, there is a substantial portion of their catalog that has not aged well. Their early work in what I dubbed the Syd Barrett era does have its place in that time in music history, but in my opinion, doesn't quite have that timeless factor. And the Gilmour era was that kind of 80s in a nondescript, very commercially friendly, no personality type of way. It sounded like they bought into whatever the music industry was selling. 2, the simplicity in their compositions and arrangements gets boring for me. I typically enjoy something more rhythmically exciting, and this is decidedly one place where Pink Floyd is lacking. Especially when you're writing a ton of songs that are longer than 5 minutes, this will make me very bored very quickly. 3, there's a lot of boilerplate melodic phrasing in their songs. There are some really cool snippet ideas, but I rarely feel like they're developed very far and have the full mileage explored out of them. It feels like they came up with a lot of them while jamming on their instruments, which they did. Without trying to take that 1, maybe 2 steps further, it only gets me so far. 4, their arrangements are very mild, which a lot of times to me comes across as being flat. Yes, that's part of what lulls the listener into sinking into the song, but there are times where that just becomes boring to me. The last 3 components, simplicity in composition, common melodies, and mild arrangements, all come together into my next point. 5, a lot of their songs start to sound the same. There are a lot of times where I will remember a melody or recognize a melody, but not remember what song or album it's from. There are songs that are quite distinct, but with not being that familiar with their catalog, they blend together pretty seamlessly. 6, their cardinal sin in my eyes are the bloated, self-indulgent compositions. I cannot with those. There were so many instances where I wanted to hit skip or just fast forward the track, because at that point I'm like, I get it. I get what you're trying to say here. Can we move on, please? I don't need to listen to this over and over again. Listening to one of these tracks uncut was not going to give me any more than a pithier version of that track. I cannot tell you how much it pisses me off when artists waste my time. It is a finite resource, and it's our most important resource as mortal beings. As background music for a hangout, fine. Doesn't bother me. If I'm asked to pay attention, as Pink Floyd asks of their audience to pay attention, absolutely not. If you are demanding my attention, it is incumbent upon you to respect my time. Again, even with all of these complaints, I still have immense respect for Pink Floyd. This is just why I don't call myself a fan. And I have so many more thoughts on this band that I wish I could communicate to you, but I don't know how I would fit them in here or organize them. This video is already so long. I could make entire videos on topics I didn't even touch on. Hell, I'm sure there will be people tearing me apart in the comments because I only barely grazed on the live shows when that's one of the most important parts of this band. I fully acknowledge that. After this experience, I find Pink Floyd far more interesting than I did before, and I have more respect for them than I did before, and I already respected them quite a bit. I better understand why I don't love this band, but more importantly, I understand why so many people love this band. The biggest takeaway for me is that I discovered that I love The Wall. That's so awesome to discover a new musical love. It's a damn good album that I could make several videos on that album alone. There's so much there. I find it such a peculiar feeling. At once, I find myself not wanting to go out of the way to listen to this band, with the exception of The Wall. But at the same time, I am so supremely curious to learn more about this band. It's really weird. They made very authentic music that spoke to a ton of people and innovated sound and music and recording and live shows as we know it. I can't think of anything that would be more beautifully prog than that. But I still think the Beatles were the first prog rock band. Those are my thoughts, guys. Let me know how I did in the comments down below. Let me know what your thoughts on Pink Floyd are in the comments down below. Does it seem like I did a bit of a reversal? Well, it's kind of because I kind of did, but didn't at the same time. If you like this video, hit that like button. Leaving a comment is super helpful. Support me on Subscribestar. Link to that is in the description down below. And you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Become the Night. Thank you guys so much for watching. See you in the next video. Rock on.